Today we're going to be talking about academic bias. There's a common complaint that everybody in the academia is in the left, and they're all left-leaning or Marxists and all that kind of stuff. You'll see if you guys look into the description that there is several works that we'll be using throughout this to discuss the subject. The common complaint is, there's a liberal bias in academia. So we want to talk about why that is, or whether or not it is, and how that affects the profession versus how that is perceived. Tristan is particularly good to be a counterpoint because he lives in Canada and they have a fairly different view of this subject, as well as he's also a PhD student as well.
Yeah, we have a different Overton window and probably just a different political culture. But on top of that, our university system is pretty similar. So it'll be useful for comparisons.
First, we need to explain our own biases. Because if we're going to be talking about bias, we better be proclaiming our own. So I'm what may be considered a centrist, probably a bit libertarian, bit socialist, kind of all over the map.
I usually politically consider myself an anarcho-syndicalist or an anarcho-pacifist. I would probably just say as far left and as far libertarian as one can get, and that's usually where I lie. When it comes to politics and history, it's hard to hide your position on things because it just informs so much of the way you think. And if anything, my leftist, Howard Zinnish point of view is what lets my channel stick out a little bit.
Now that we've said that, it's just kind of like, yeah, we have our own biases, but the real question that a lot of people have when they hear that or proclaim it really is academia in fact left-leaning? The left is a very different thing in Canada. So here Hillary Clinton is on the left, whereas there it wouldn't be.
The Overton window is basically like the sliver of political opinion that is considered acceptable by any given society. And so Canada's would definitely be considered way to the left of the United States. Like, for example, you would be very hard-pressed to find a conservative politician in our country who does not support our single-payer healthcare system, for example. I feel like there's just a different culture of political culture. Like, we don't put our politics as core to our identity, and we don't have as much of an antagonistic relationship between different political leanings, especially because we actually have third choices and things like that.
Whereas here we've had a pretty straightforward split in terms of political parties since, the Civil War, basically. What actual political opinions those sides hold have kind of flip-flopped over time, basically starting with Wilson and ending with Nixon, basically over civil rights. It's funny because, when you think about it, Wilson kind of started the flip by his whole...
Oh no, we're getting you started on Woodrow Wilson again.
He started the whole switch over to, neoliberalism, that New Liberty was what he called it, basically turning progressivism into liberalism. But Wilson wasn't exactly good for civil rights, but later Democrats were. Really what defines our split is what Democrats support and what Republicans support.
In the United States, though, it feels like, at least compared to other countries, more tribal. Like, your identity behind a political party tends to be more part of one's own identity in a bigger way, I guess, if that makes sense.
The map is actually a lot more purple than, the Electoral College would make it look. You'll find that oftentimes it's like 51% versus 49, rather than, 90 versus 10. There's
political issues where disagreement feels like it's more than just like, I have a different interpretation on things than you do.
A lot of our politics kind of go by brand loyalty. I would guess that that's not really the case in Canada.
No, not as much. I don't think people identify as much with a political party, and our elections are only like 3 weeks long.
Basically, we have our politics defined by party, and one party is explicitly conservative while the other wants change. As an election a few back was saying, no change versus change here. And there it's less easy to find a centered.
Yeah, I think that our political spectrum is a little bit less defined in that way.
Because of that, we're going to have differing ideas in terms of what bias counts as in colleges, in academia. The common complaint here in America is, of course, there's a liberal bias, that there is that everybody's a Democrat. The data does seem to pan out that there is many more registered Democrats in universities than Republicans compared to the general population. And how does that pan out in Canada with so many parties?
If I were to actually ask about it, I probably wouldn't even know which parties most of the people that I know support or vote for. And I don't even think that most people would be identified with any in particular. The only time when we actually talk about politics is usually when the writ's been dropped. And even then, there's a lot of room for massive swings. So if we were to talk about there being a liberal or conservative bias in our academia, it would have to be over issues that come up. The big story that we've had is University of Toronto professor got kind of publicly run through the mud because he kept saying that he wanted to defend his freedom of speech to intentionally misgender his students and basically be a dick to trans people.
Wow.
Because he was being censored for intentionally misgendering his students. He got a platform on a whole bunch of far-right talk shows and all those things. And then he went on free speech tours where he did not get turned away from talks or anything like that. I don't hear the same kind of Hofstadterian disdain for liberal academics like you hear in American political discourse.
Part of it here, in terms of why it's so prominent in political discourse, is that not so much that there's a problem, but that there are very vocal professors who are on the left side of politics that go out and express their opinion in some public fashion that challenges the Republican side of things.
Is it that there are a lot of conservatives in America who just feel less of an identity with the Republican Party, specifically the brand? Because the Republican Party is a bit more ideological, and so if you're a center-right econ professor, you might feel less inclined to say that you're a Republican than you're a conservative.
That's such an interesting thing in terms of our academic bias politics, is that different departments clearly show that there is more of a political lean in the liberal arts versus something like the business school. And what makes it really weird is that there's a lot of independence. Every single one of these studies that we have down in the description talks about how tough it is to even to try to figure out what those party lines are. But even when they go off of voter records and self-admitted data, that it's never as far of a political leaning as the conservative media would have you believe.
I refuse to believe that the American conservative media exaggerates something.
That there is also a significant factor that these pundits like to trot out in terms of bias, and that's identity politics. Whether you identify as trans or gay and all that, or you're a woman or black or some sort of minority or marginalized group. There's supposed to be some sort of bias in the academic system towards people who support those people. The main thing is that there is supposed to be some sort of benefits package that affirmative action and things like that are driving the politics towards the left.
It plays into a lot of things. Some of them are very American, some are not. The United States does have a long and very troubled history when it comes to race. Canada is much better at ignoring in our own history. The claim is that the universities give an unrealistic or an unfair advantage to people who are of these oppressed identity groups. And that then creates a university culture that is too left-wing or just more left-wing than the average. I do feel like in some ways that does treat some identity groups like they're a political monolith. The Republican Party's done such a good job at like basically kicking out anybody who's different from their party. That of the black people in America, overwhelming support for the Democrats, but not necessarily because they're all left wing. The Democrats then have a lot of these minority groups that are of all different political persuasions, but are Democrats because there's no real other options.
Especially when you look at presidents, that definitely holds true in terms of Republicans starting to alienate their minority base.
You know, any right-wing white millennial is going to be a Republican, but a right-wing black millennial is not going to be a Republican. So they're in the Democratic Party as well.
It holds true in terms of demographics, and it pushes right into academia. The complaint of the conservative media is that affirmative action policies and that are forcing academia to become more left-wing, because affirmative action programs specifically target minorities and marginalized identities.
Yeah, and I guess I would just take umbrage with the idea that just because you are, putting in an affirmative action program to allow more people of different minority groups and more women into universities, that you're going to shift the political spectrum, because, as I said, the Democrats have a lot of conservatives in their midst. Maybe you'll have more Democrat-identified people, but I don't think you're going to shift the political leaning.
For me, when I was looking at these studies, and especially that book, it seemed to indicate that academia hasn't really changed that much over time, and that would kind of disprove the whole affirmative action is making academia more liberal biased. They all seem to indicate that if there is a change, it's subtle. The studies that have tried to say that there's been a massive shift to the left, they're cherry-picking data.
It's not really the academy that's changed, but it's the country that they're based in that's changed.
Yeah, I could see that. The only one of these sources that actually talked about the overall change in terms of politics was Gross. I didn't see much in terms of academia stayed still and country just went right. I could see that.
Yeah, there's some other things you can add in there too that I think complicate matters. Like maybe that's true in like sheer admissions, but when it comes to like support for research and support for the careers of academics, if you're like an openly right-wing like academic, you have way more of a support network when it comes to like funding and platform.
It kind of depends, especially if you look at the history profession specifically, which I mean we kind of have to focus on that since that's where we are. The history profession has a lot of research grants and whatnot that what may be deemed identity politics. The whole race, class, and gender paradigm that we are basically in. Multiculturalism is kind of the main focus of study at the moment. There's been kind of like a push away from like American exceptionalism, great man history, and military history. Those kind of have been getting pushed out, and that could be more left turn in the profession.
It depends upon where you see things going. Like, I mean, it might be that history started out as a field that was very skewed in one direction, and now it's just balancing things out. And plus, a lot of this stuff that shows it's like, moving into these different areas of historical research could just be a sign that we're developing as a discipline new ways of looking at sources. Like any other discipline, like we don't have revisionist science when we added quantum mechanics to physics, or like revision, it's a discipline, and historians have been building upon each other's work for decades. Like any other discipline, yeah, we have moments where like a group of thinkers who are focused in a different way backlash against the people who came before them and do something new. And like, that's true of all disciplines.
Yeah, unlike, science, where you can claim that, politics doesn't matter. There's no politics in science. Things like climate change being politicized, it's politicized outside of academia. With history, you don't get to have that separation between politics and your scholarship, because your scholarship undergirds a bunch of political ideologies.
Yep. That's probably why both of us get so many of our videos demonetized.
History is inherently political. we can't undo that. But at the same time, are we changing the history? Are revisionists wrong?
Let's talk about postmodernism and how we know the things we know. I think that if you were to look at the long history of history, it's this field that has attempted to be a science and failed over and over again, because what we do is look at our evidence is in language and in construction. For example, like we know that 2 + 2 is 4 because there's no like interpretation. You can't reinterpret 2 to be 1 or 3.
The system of numbers itself means 1 + 1 is 2. It just is.
Reading a text, we will never be able to objectively say that a text says something. And over time, we are going to be changing the way that we read text, changing the way that we understand the past with more sources and more advanced ways of looking at different things, that we're never ever going to have a perfect view of the past. We're always going to have the most modern interpretation possible of the past. And that means that 50 years from now, when we have a completely different society, we're going to read texts from the past differently than we read them today, because we'll change collectively. Things are always going to be changing in history. We're always going to be reinterpreting. We're always going to be unearthing new facts. And it all comes down to the fact that we use human-created sources.
The idea that subjectivity requires revisionism. If we are going to base history on telling stories, which that's what it is, and it has to be true stories, the problem is the only way we can do it is through using evidence that is inherently unreliable. So there will always be room for interpretation in terms of whether or not you believe something. There's a lot of subjectivity that we had just in critique. Then there's also bringing in new data. A lot of new interpretations are done through simply saying, like, let's look at it from a different person's perspective. Oh wait, hey, here's some sources that were previously not known. There's those two sources of subjectivity that we can never get rid of. Revisionism is not a bad thing, necessarily, although it's normally used as a derogatory term, but in historiography, it's just kind of been accepted. It's like Yankee Doodle was originally an insult, but now I'm a proud Yankee. The profession has kind of embraced the term revisionist.
I think, though, that one of the things that is really important for us to talk about when it comes to history specifically, because history was born in the late 19th century, nation moment and the rise of nationalism. History has a large role in nation building as it evolves as an academic discipline to get away from nation and nationality. The people who saw their past as part of their overall national story are going to feel like their identity is being challenged. Like how a lot of conservatives who are anti-climate change aren't opposing it because they actually legitimately have issues with the science, but it's because they don't like what climate change represents.
Of course, we're talking about nationalism here, and the conservative media's complaint with academia is that it's bringing in identity politics more so than it should be, or so on and so forth. Their real complaint is that it's challenging their identity. Funny, the people who complain about identity politics are very much complaining about their identities being challenged.
But there's really no separating your perspective from the identity you grew up in, because it's not something, not all the time, it's not something you choose for yourself, it's something that is ascribed to you.
The entire study of history kind of is, I think it was actually Nietzsche who said this, that it's the graveyard of ideas. The study of history is much better at challenging ideas than supporting them. When it comes to being politically biased in terms of the scholarship and that, it's easier to go after race, class, and gender right now because that is where critique may lie.
Historians are just people who really love saying, well, actually.
We love that word context. Context always has a way of blunting one's ideology.
Yeah, and when you attack things like ideology in the broad sense and national mythology and those kinds of things, people take it as an attack on their identity. And that's why I think there is like a large backlash when you demythologize a character in history or something like that. And I can't speak for all disciplines, but I imagine that's where a lot of the idea that like, oh, the academy is just a bunch of liberals can come from. Conservatism in general is like a anti-change type of position. And so changing things in general is going to be seen as disruptive and challenging.
Yeah, we've always had the kind of nationalist history, but there's always been that undercurrent of using context to kind of blunt ideology. You know, folks like the Beards and Becker were very much using their more left-leaning politics in academia and to influence their scholarship and use it to make scholastic claims. So I think it's somewhat of the nature of scholarship is that it will challenge the status quo, as such, always be somewhat left-leaning.
I have heard the occasional discussion about us trying to move as a discipline away from like using the nation as the chief category for our focus of research, like trying to get like states out of the center focus.
Even trying to define what a nation is and when it begins, like it's called like imagined communities or something like that.
Oh, Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities?
The main thing on that is saying that like the entire idea of nationhood is predicated on a group self-identifying as a group. And that doesn't really happen until after 1848. So the idea of nations is really new, and nations as a consequence are also really new, which also means that how do you do a national history of something that didn't exist in the 16th century when you're trying to study ancient Rome or something like that?
This is the kind of thing that historians talk about, like at late at night when you've had 6 or 7 beers in you. Like this is like the stuff that the discipline's going to have to tackle in the next like several decades. I think it's like the next big step to try to like get out of the nation focus. Because yeah, history was kind of born in the nation building moment. But yeah, I think that history has played a role in the perpetuation of the concept of nation. Maybe that's the future of our field, is to get ourselves out of it.
One of the things that a lot of these conservative media pundits are complaining about is the shift to what's often called new history. A lot of people just call it revisionism. That idea that it's switched over from being glorifying to being vilifying. That the profession used to be very optimistic about where things were going or about the past, and now it's studying how racist, how bigoted or sexist or whatever the past was. That's what they're often complaining about. Is historians are complaining about things, so therefore they're complaining about historians complaining.
Yeah, and so that would depend upon how much you like or don't like the concept of like looking at things in a Hegelian sense. Howard Zinn would have argued that he wasn't subtracting from these people's good sides by writing about their bad sides, but he was sort of trying to add so that you could balance out the two columns, you know? Is like focusing on the negative when you feel like there's been too much focus on the positive. Is that the good way to go about writing, or should you try to just be balanced in your own work? I can see valid arguments for both.
But I also think that it's not as clear cut. Yes, it does seem that the new history, the new left history, has been mostly seeking to blame something. So I have to wonder how much of that revisionist paradigm is because of growing focus.
If you answer that question and write a book about it, you're going to get so many awards and speaking engagements. Because you basically solved history.
Part of the bias that we're worried about is that there's an institutional push for revisionism, and people want that nationalist history to continue, that Orthodox history, as I've termed it in the previous episode. And Orthodox history is basically being pushed out, which I don't see that as being incorrect.
It's like when a new predominant theory takes place, you have to kind of rewrite all of the rules because the new theory makes other things irrelevant. This is actually a big part of my dissertation, is this thought process, because there is always going to be a tension between what academic historians are doing and what the collective history or the collective narrative is going to be. Their goals are for different purposes. And my dissertation actually works on like, how do we build collective narratives? How do we decide what's going to be the orthodox history at any given time?
I think we don't know where the profession will ultimately be in, a decade or two. And it could very easily be that it switches to being more glorified. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but we're historians, we're not forecasters.
Most take umbrage to the entire concept of forecasting.
I keep on saying paradigm because, I'm basically referencing Kuhn over and over again. Kuhn's whole paradigmatic model is that once something comes in, it's hard to challenge. So conservative pundits are complaining that this new paradigm that has basically been instituted since the 1960s, that's focused on race, class, and gender as its primary subject matter, that there's no way to enter academia because there's an inherent bias if you have a differing idea. Do you think that's true?
It depends upon the situation. Like, I think that it would depend upon the group you're in because these tend to be very small and the office culture of the departments that they're in. Because as I was saying before we started up, that like I actually am in a fairly conservative university and a fairly conservative history department.
I've been in 3 different history departments, and you'll have fairly avowed left-leaning folks. You'll have avowed Marxists and avowed anarchists, and that take up prominent positions within the department. So, obviously, there's definitely that left lean, but academia isn't set up to just kind of reconfirm its own bias, which is what they're complaining about. It's set up specifically to debate, to constantly challenge with new scholarship and new evidence. If you put out the same amount of work as somebody who's fairly left-leaning and you're right-leaning, and you have some new thing that actually challenges the paradigm, I don't think you're going to be shut out. I think you're going to have a lot of opportunity, actually.
As long as you're not creating a toxic environment, they encourage you to follow wherever your intellect leads you. And usually if there's a debate between left and right-wing discussions, you might be a little outnumbered sometimes depending upon where the discussion's going, but there's nobody who would say, turn down your dissertation because it talked about a white guy.
Salas, I think maybe, I'm not going to be able to find it quickly. One of them gave some specific times in which professors assigned people to go and protest the Iraq war. But in each of those, there was disciplinary action against the professor. And there is obviously that more left-leaning bias, at least in the American history profession, but it can be challenged. And even when it does become overbearing, overstepping of bounds is denounced.
Yeah, and if there's anything that you can say about academics is that they love picking fights, whenever possible. So I don't know if you could ever have a ruling paradigm at any university for too long, because then someone's just going to say something.
The history profession is always built to challenge, and even itself is the thing. It challenges itself.
And some positions that would maybe be considered right-wing positions just tend to not survive long in academia because they are not on the solidest of foundations. And this is things that they don't even deny. Newt Gingrich, I think, at the RNC was even saying, yeah, it might not be true, but that's what people are feeling.
Yeah, and Newt Gingrich is a classic example of why this whole academia that has a liberal bias doesn't exactly fit, because Newt Gingrich is a historian. He was even a professor. So he was a member of academia, and yet he is a prominent member of the Republican Party. My most hated politician, Wilson, was fairly right-leaning when it came to social issues, was the president of Princeton. A lot of historians who end up going into politics end up being conservative. I remember having a conversation with a former roommate, and we were talking about what you learn as a historian and he just offhandedly well, there should be more historians who are politicians, and I was just no we don't make good politicians.
No, any historian that becomes a politician would be way too timid.
Except for the ones that have, and like we don't have a good history on that. We've been going for an hour now, so I think we can switch over to directly answering some of the questions. So changing curriculums is what he's asking about.
Yeah, I think that the history curriculum thing, that's a debate that comes up a lot whenever we talk about textbooks and stuff. And that is, I think, the front lines when that idea of history as academic discipline versus history as nation-building project, that's like where they hit each other head on. And that's why you end up with, what was that crazy thing that happened in Texas where like they had a textbook where they called slaves like imported migrants or something like that? It was something weird. It was like...
What?
There was some textbook that Texas was going to buy for its history curriculum where they refused to use the word slave and slavery. And they called them like unwilling imported migrants or something like that.
There's an excellent book, Past Imperfect, by Peter Hoffer. I have it digitally, unfortunately, so I can't just wave it around. He has an entire chapter on this first, when the Enola Gay exhibit was done at the Smithsonian. There was concern about what that represented, and then there was, I think it was called the National Standard, and so they were trying to make a standard textbook that would be assigned to all history classes throughout the country, and you know how that can turn, and it turned bad real quick.
I think, though, that if I were to like propose a solution of any, it's that we need to start teaching history more as a verb than a noun and get more people looking at primary sources and making inferences and making those connections rather than having like a book full of all the facts. But
I picked these up a while ago. They're supposed to be textbooks, but they're essentially just organized primary sources. I've never seen this assigned anywhere. It's designed to be basically nothing but primary sources. There's some introductory text in that, and there's always going to have to be some sort of interpretation there. And there's, of course, comparative questions and that, but there's no want to assign this kind of thing in classes, it appears.
It undermines the nation-building project in some ways. We do have questions about...
This is Tyler Fromm. I don't know how to say her name, man. So he's basically asking if there's interdisciplinary work being done, and is that interdisciplinary work changing the history profession?
Yes, and it's good. My dissertation is about applying things that come from like computer science and like big data to history. One of the greatest things about history specifically, but about being an academic, is that you can grab things from different fields and you can learn new things. That's how we all grow. I'm not sure where the thing that people are getting worried about is.
So like for sociology, for instance, there is a lot of differing standards that would make the profession kind of difficult. So like they have, I forgot what it's called, these committees that basically you have to go through that approve your sources and how much you're making your sources anonymous. And in history, that's viewed as a fairly bad thing. I could see that being a concern, that standards and practices from other professions, once their theory gets ported over, their standards also come along with those theories and start screwing with the history profession.
And it'll be complicated, it's a mess, but so being an academic basically is, isn't it?
It's ultimately just another tool. It's not something that is going to destroy the profession.
Like, I don't do military history.
Oh, and we have a question on that.
Not because, like, I don't think military history is worth doing. I just feel like it's been overdone.
So the question, I'm guessing your name is Jorge or George? It's
Jorge, 6207.
Yeah. So he's asking, why is military history so underrated in academia? Why is military history kind of moving out of the profession? There's no lack of writing in terms of military history, but why is it not in academia? Why is it moving to more public history or popular history?
It feels so like 19th century, like focusing too much on something like battles and who won them and how they moved and stuff like that. Like, it only gets you so far. The heyday of military history was back when, like, historians were like leaf collectors.
A lot of them were like antiquarians. But that means that it was always kind of a pop in public history rather than academic history. Oh, for some people who might not know, public history is not, are historians who, like, we basically do public history. We're not producing this content for academia. we're producing this for YouTube, but we're also doing it less to be popular, but more to be scholastic. So that's public history. Pop history is just kind of writing for the fun of it.
Yeah, for-profit history. Sometimes it's really good, like something that you're writing for profit, that you know people are going to want to buy.
So military history will never go away from popular and public history. I think academia has kind of moved away, not because of inherent bias or anything, but more because there's not a lot of good analysis to be done that hasn't already been done. One of my passions is American small wars, and I guess you could call that military history, but I'm not concerned about battles and what general moved troops where and all that kind of stuff. And I don't really care about seeing troop movements on a map. What I care about is the cause and effect. The why did it happen and what did it do?
Military history is just kind of from a different era of the field, and now as we've kind of matured, it's become a part of a bigger thing. Like we stopped asking what and started asking why more often.
We can't avoid warfare when we study history. Military history still matters. Studying warfare and that matters, but it's just kind of taken on a different purpose.
Yeah, and I think the traditional military history just was always kind of for hobbyists who have little models and maps on their walls and stuff.
There is still room for academic military history. I've got a couple of professors who actually are military historians. So they're still there. It's not like it's completely gone, but the orientation has changed. I think even in places like West Point and that, you'll find that military historians are less focused on troop movements and who won what battle, and more on how strategies affected the war in general, like what was done by people rather than like movements on a board.
We have a lot of military history. We have a world-renowned Canadian World War I expert in our department that always has a whole bunch of grad students. His study, I think, is more about how World War I affected the idea of Canada, how we didn't have a nationalism, and how countries that were in the Dominions used World War I to develop a nationalism and to do nation building. And this is why Canada and Australia are the countries that actually make the biggest deals about World War I for some reason. And there's also more competition. There's just more historians doing more different things, and that it's going to become a small percentage as the field diversifies and grows.
Also, in terms of competition, pop history has gotten a lot better.
But what about Rush Revere?
The what?
Rush Revere, the Rush Limbaugh children's book about the American Revolution. It's a real thing.
Okay. I guess something like that has to exist, but no. Pop history, besides folks like that, typically will have a lot of citation in that. So there's actually pretty good competition against academic history by pop historians now, so just let them do their thing. Yeah, Julian Swans asks, what makes a good history book?
Ooh.
So, yeah. This actually does play into the main theme of the video, which is academic bias, because as I've stated multiple times already, bias isn't incorrect, but what makes something correct, and even further, what makes it good? Because you could see that a good history book is simply that one that plays into the current biases of the profession. I don't think any academic's going to agree with that.
No, unless they're really postmodernist. That's next level postmodernist. That's when you exist outside of time.
You start experiencing reality like Dr. Manhattan.
A good history, it depends upon what you're doing. I think there are some really great history books that are great because they're either exposing or exploring something that hasn't been given form before. But I think that, I don't know, it's like saying what makes a good science fiction novel. There's a lot of people that read those for a lot of different purposes and a lot of different things.
But even with something like science fiction, you can say there are some unifying things that are needed to be good. So like in science fiction, you need to be exploring some sort of idea, because science fiction is always about like the idea. It's, a dystopia isn't about like, look how bad this is. This is like a dystopian novel is almost like a reductio ad absurdum.
So I guess then solid grounded research that is at least current, usually, exploring ideas. Like, I think that history books that are just reciting long lists of facts are, one, boring, and two, will kind of lose the forest for the trees.
So novelty.
At least when it comes to like things that I just want to read for my own entertainment.
Yeah, there's like a difference between good history as in like just, this is good scholarship. And that just depends on like how much evidence are you using? How much does your prose follow the actual logic of the evidence being given, and so on and so forth. That old scientific history kind of thing. That's just purely like how good of a scholar are you? But then there's also that what makes it good
literature.
Because it can't be the same as like when H.G. Wells wrote his history. That's not good history. It's got to be something more than just excellent prose.
Yeah, it's a hard balancing act, but and only a few people do it really well. That's what we're trying to do, and I don't know how well we do it. Depends. Depends on the video.
We're also kind of charting out a very new thing. There's a whole bunch of history YouTubers now. I started in 2013 when there wasn't as many. But even with that, a lot of history YouTubers are coming at it from a different profession. You'll have like journalists or people who are in like high school and things like that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it does mean that it's still somewhat uncharted territory for scholars. To bring it back to the question that we were asked, what makes it a good book? Affording a good interpretation that we can use. Being an American, gotta go with pragmatism. But if it's a useful book, if it's useful for its particular interpretation, if it's useful for explaining something, maybe that's what makes a good history book.
There's a lot of room also for people who are just good at writing narrative and good at writing, period. I feel like history puts more of an emphasis on that than, say, like biochemistry. Well then, I think we had a really good chat.
But I think this is a good place to end it.
I felt pretty productive. I feel like we came to some interesting talking points.
Well, we definitely covered the whole academic bias thing. Basically, not as big of a deal as everybody makes it out to. Kind of necessary and doesn't hurt the profession.
Yeah, and makes a lot more sense in America than in any other country.
I guess that's it, guys.